WDET is supported by the College of Business Administration at University of Detroit Mercy. UDM's Master of Business Administration is designed to accommodate the career needs of professionals across a variety of work organizations. More information at business.udmercy.edu.
It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET. I'm Nick Austin, flying solo as Tia Graham returns tomorrow. Today on the program, Detroit has decided to renovate several low-income apartments with $1.6 million of investment. But just how far will the money go? We'll talk to the city's housing director about the plan. But first on the Metro, the legalization of recreational marijuana caused many employers to re-examine their drug testing policies. But an emerging breathalyzer designed to determine whether someone is currently under the influence of cannabis, now offered at several medical centers around the state, may be changing some employers' calculations. According to Hound Labs, the company behind the tests, they're designed to deter workday cannabis use. Still, some argue that tests like these unfairly intrude on employee privacy, especially given the legality of personal use in our state. To learn more about where we're at with cannabis testing, we're joined by Adrienne Roberts. She's a business reporter who also covers Michigan's cannabis industry for the Detroit Free Press. Adrienne, welcome to the Metro.
Thanks for having me.
So let's delve into this breathalyzer specifically developed by Hound Labs. How's it different from traditional tests that we had previously, and why is this an important distinction?
Yeah, so this device detects for recent use, and that's a big deal because when we look at the other tests that are available on the market, and these are very common, we think urine, saliva, hair, they detect habitual use or use, a day ago, weeks ago, even months ago. So this is the first one that really acts almost like a breathalyzer for alcohol, where it's detecting, in the last 3 hours, did you consume cannabis?
Yeah, how widely is it being used right now from what you've seen?
So not widely. This is a very new technology. They have 25 kind of base stations, they call them in Michigan, which means devices basically. And there's only about 120 across the U.S. So Michigan is really actually a big market for this company, but it's still very early days.
In terms of it being early days, are we noticing a certain industry that's more likely to adopt it right now? Where are we seeing it deployed?
Yeah, so Hound Labs, when I talked to them, they brought up the automotive industry and manufacturing. And I think it makes sense because when you think about industries that, you may want to make sure someone is sober and, if they're lifting heavy equipment, it would make sense that maybe you'd want to make sure that person isn't high on the job. And this would detect it for that. I think in the past, if you thought that as the employer, you could administer a drug test, but that doesn't really tell you that they're actually high in that moment. That tells you that maybe they use cannabis the night before. So I think that's where we're going to see it have, some growing use.
Yeah. Have we learned anything about the accuracy of the test right now, what people are saying about it?
So there's an important distinction between what this breathalyzer does and what an alcohol breathalyzer would do, which can tell you, how the level of intoxication. This can't do it. It's only, a positive or a negative result. But they did say, they've had to have employers go back and get samples of the air around even the testing area, because sometimes the air, if that has cannabis in the air, that can affect the test results. So it really needs to be a controlled environment.
Sure. So for some of these early adopters who are using the test, then I know the legalization of marijuana caused a lot of employers to rethink their policies. Are these places where they kind of wanted that use but didn't have a testing procedure in place, but now because of the new technology are using it?
So it's interesting. And I think it's so early that I didn't get to talk to any employers that are using this. And Concentra, I thought was interesting. They're a medical center that offers these tests. I reached out to them and they're like, we can confirm we offer them, but we're not going to make anyone available for an interview. And, I don't know why, but it's made sense to me that they're kind of just still figuring this out and figuring if, this is something that they can move forward and really use as an indicator, as opposed to maybe someone being trained on site to say, oh, these are signs of someone being high
Yeah.
and they should go home for the day or whatever.
We're speaking with Adrienne Roberts, again, who's a business reporter with the Detroit Free Press. And now, Adrienne, now that we have kind of some of the facts out here, I do want to take a look back to or think about some of the things people who are listening to this might be concerned about. For example, it's legal to use recreational marijuana in the state of Michigan. So do you have any insight into that balance of privacy or fairness that employees, I should say, are thinking about here? Because for them, they might say, well, wait a second, what I do on my personal time is my time.
I think this is like the most perplexing question to me, and one that I've been thinking about. So when I started covering Michigan's cannabis industry in 2021, it was at that moment, if you remember, it was a really tight labor market.
Mm-hmm.
And so employers were saying, what barriers to entry can we remove so that we can get good talent? And that was one of them, was this pre-employment cannabis testing. And it still, it just strikes me as odd that we're testing for this. If someone wants to do that on their own time, it's legal in the state of Michigan. So why can't they? So I think, to me, this test is maybe one step, in the direction of really pinpointing that use and saying, okay, actually, you were high on the job, and that, as the employer, they have the right to do whatever they want.
Right. And I think there's going to be some more look at, again, the accuracy of these things. If it's really telling you, no, you had amounts in there, would they be enough amount that it would cause you to have impact on your job performance, right? Trace amounts versus, from the end of an evening or something like that versus active use right before you go into work. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's the question. And this doesn't tell you to what level you are impaired. Mm-hmm. So I think it's still going to be a question, even if you get that test result back as the employer and it says, oh, it's a positive result, there is cannabis in your system. If the employee says, no, I didn't consume in the last 3 hours, what are you going to do in that situation? So I think it's a tool, but I don't know if it's the end-all be-all at this point.
Right. You mentioned it was supposed to be for recent use. Do we have any understanding, or do you have any understanding, to the hours or minute? Are we talking about it's just what is in your system right now? I know you mentioned that you have some, but in terms of that delay, right? One of the reasons you could use hair was because it would stay in your systems for so long. So how does that separate as you understand it?
So they say it's a 3-hour detection window. And it's testing for THC in the system rather than, it's a different test that they're doing for the hair, for saliva. So that's the premise of it, that it's different than these other tests. But I think, we'll see how that plays out moving forward.
I think the tight labor market portion of this is also important, because this is something that might get implemented now when the labor market is tight and companies have disincentive to prevent having good talent from coming in. However, later on, if the employment market isn't as tight, but you still have rules like this on the books, it may be a pretext or a pretty effective way to kind of bounce people out there. Are we thinking about the implementations of these things now in a tight labor market versus when a labor market might be looser?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. It's weird to me that, okay, now there's a tight labor market and now we need to address this as the employer, when really recreational cannabis was legal in 2018. So it's kind of the impetus for that is a little off, in my opinion. Even when I started at my job, I had to take a drug test. Yeah. And they tested for all different drugs, including marijuana. So, Amazon a few years ago was really the big employer that came out and said, we're not going to do pre-employment drug screenings for marijuana anymore. So I think it remains to be seen if that trend continues. We don't have there's no data on this. It's really anecdotes that I'm hearing from staffing firms or employment lawyers that are saying, okay, yeah, people are, reevaluating it. But we'll have to see, in a few years if they follow through.
But you bring up that you had to take a test also, which my understanding, that more test for habitual use, or, if there's an issues where there might be a long-term problem as opposed to someone who's doing something recreationally on their own. And that gets to kind of the effectiveness or how there might be an impact on the job, because we've had recreational marijuana in Michigan for a while now. In terms of what you've seen just in your general work, have we noticed any change in employment performance? You talk about these physical jobs. I mean, has worker safety gone down, up? What have you seen in this space? What did you hear from people?
Okay, so there is data to support this, and Quest Diagnostics, which is one of the the largest testing companies in the country and tests millions or test millions of these tests every year, they are seeing an increase in positive marijuana tests in Michigan especially. So it's interesting. It's like of all the tests that came back last year, 6% were positive for marijuana. And in the U.S., it's only like 3%. So I think there is possibly some correlation between the legalization of recreational marijuana in Michigan and these test results. And that number has been increasing since 2018. So that does say something. There are more of these positive tests coming back. And so I think employers still need to consider that, especially if they're, in an industry that's really concerned with safety.
Right. And especially if you're putting other employees out there, you don't want them to get hurt. You don't want the liability for someone getting hurt or doing improper work on the job that might be linked to something that someone would say, hey, why weren't you doing this testing to check? Or everybody knew John was high on the job. How did you not know? I can understand that concern, but still, I would also be interested in knowing if we've seen, since marijuana has been legalized, any increase in safety issues, any increase in more damage, harm, injuries, or anything like that. I don't know if you've seen anything like that, but what are you hearing about that in the space?
I haven't heard that totally. I think what I've seen is the companies that are going to test for marijuana and feel like they need to for safety are going to continue to do that. And especially the ones that, because marijuana is still illegal at a federal level, any company that receives federal funding or does any work with the federal government, they're still going to test. But it's more the companies, who are doing office work or, jobs that don't necessarily require you to, safety isn't a concern. They're the ones that are looking at relaxing those policies or have dropped them completely.
Have we seen anything in terms of state actors, legislators? Is this a space where they're just going to let private industry deal with it? Or have you heard any inklings from lawmakers on what they're thinking about in this space?
So the state of Michigan, as an employer, was actually looking at dropping this pre-employment cannabis screening because they were losing out on potential hires who were failing that test. So there's been some movement there, but that's about it. Otherwise, it's really to the private sector.
Yeah. So what are you now looking forward into this space? I should actually check. Was there a specific thing that tipped you off or made you even decide to look in this into the first place?
Yeah, Hound Labs, I've been following this company for a few years just because given this backdrop of what I've been reporting on, I thought, wow, this company could really kind of maybe change the game in that sense. And so, a few months ago, they said, hey, we're in Michigan, we're doing this roadshow, we're talking to employers. And then they put out a press release recently saying, hey, now we're in Concentra medical centers in the state. And come to find out, they've been here for a few months at private employers. And so I think it'll only grow from there.
Yeah, this is a process where an employee says, hey, we need you to take a test. You got to go to Concentra and take it. Do we know, what is it, like a randomized sampling, or how do they choose, if you know?
So this is the interesting part of it too. I don't know how they decide who needs to go, but right now the technology is not one where you get a test result back immediately. You actually have to send it off to Quest Diagnostics, who gets you that result within 72 hours or around that time frame. So I don't really know how you would, if you think an employee's high on the job, you send them to go get a test. Well, you don't really know, right. You don't know if they are for days. So I think it could be more of a disciplinary tool, but sure. I don't think it at this point, it doesn't give you the power to send someone home. But they are working on a test that would give you a result.
All right, Adrian. Well, you've been looking at this. Is there anything else that you're looking at in this space or in the cannabis industry generally? What are you looking at these days?
Yeah, so I think the next thing, and the thing that came to mind immediately is, could this be used for law enforcement? Mm-hmm. Right now, if you're pulled over and a police officer suspects that you're high and you're driving while, using cannabis, they really can only, it's more of they have to look at you and say, okay, these are the signs. Got to have
probable cause, reasonable suspicion in order to do a test. But you're wondering, if you have this, maybe that could be used. For example, a PBT, right? In a driving situation, upon suspicion, they'll give you that. But that's not the same thing as a breathalyzer. That's that portable test that they use versus the one at the station. You're thinking, could we get to a point where we do something similar with this?
Yeah, exactly. And they have not, Hound Labs has not approached law enforcement yet. But to me, that could be the next big thing that could really change.
All right. Well, we're going to have to monitor this on our end also. But Adrian Roberts, who's business reporter with the Detroit Free Press, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thanks for having me.
It's the Metro on 1019 WDET, and coming up, we'll discuss why the city of Detroit is investing over $6 million in renovating low-income apartments. It's the Metro on 1019 WDET, where, listen, we understand the struggle is real because for many in Michigan, the rent is just too dang high. And that's why the state saw one of its highest increases in rent prices, because it's just going up and up and up. 12% from January of 2023 to 2024, according to a report. And when rents go up, people often end up on the streets because not having enough affordable housing means having more people without homes. Less homelessness is now projected in the city since leaders recently decided to spend $6.1 million to renovate 8 affordable apartment units in and around Southwest Michigan, or Southwest Detroit. Those units will maintain about 400 affordable housing units. The city spent this money out of its general fund because of an agreement it made with the Department of Housing and Urban Development after it didn't comply with the standards of its Motor City Match program. But why did the city decide to spend $6.1 million on 8 low-income apartment buildings specifically, and when does it hope that the buildings will be fully renovated? To discuss this, we're joined by Julie Schneider. She's the director of Detroit's Housing and Revitalization Department. Director Schneider, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, with the understanding that the city needed to spend the money because of the issues with the Motor City Match program, why did the city decide to invest the $6.1 million specifically on renovating these 8 low-income apartment buildings as opposed to some other investment?
Well, as you mentioned in your intro, the need for affordable housing is felt by many. And so I think we are looking to identify funding whenever and wherever possible to be able to increase the amount of money that we're able to invest in affordable housing. So with the stipulations that we had from HUD, it required that we make an investment in a community development block grant eligible use. Affordable housing is not only that; it's a major priority of ours for the city.
Yeah, well, that is good, and people really do care about this. It's going to have an appreciable impact on folks' lives, but I'm wondering why the decision is coming specifically now. What led to this being the time for it?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, so in terms of investing in affordable housing, it's something that we do every single day and have been working to preserve existing affordable housing. In terms of this particular action, there's a couple of more specific reasons. One, these buildings have all requested funding to be able to complete renovations, and we present the ability for people to apply for funding typically twice annually for developers and property owners to be able to access our funds. And for this particular reason related to Motor City Match, it was related to us reaching agreement to be able to put those concerns in the past and be able to reach an agreement to be able to move forward.
I'm glad that folks out there or some of these buildings that had availability were able to get in touch with you. I note that since it's concentrated kind of in this area, was there any thought to other places in and around Detroit, or is there a specific reason why Southwest Detroit was the location that you wanted to make sure to have these units in?
Well, so we receive funding through Community Development Block Grant annually. We receive funding from Home. We receive an annual allocation from through the city budgeting process for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund dollars. Each of those programs have different regulations. So when we are identifying which funds are going to go into which development, it's really based on matching those regulations with the kind of situation or details of any particular development. So we're making quite a bit more investments. In fact, I think we had City Council approve somewhere around $20 million of investments that span the city. So it's just that these funds worked best for these particular developments, and it wasn't necessarily targeting these funds in any particular geography.
Gotcha. We're speaking with Julie Schneider, who's the director of Detroit's Housing and Revitalization Department. And Director Schneider, that kind of makes me wonder, you talk about the number, the money that you have, but one of the issues we're having in terms of housing is access to housing, but also the ability to build, labor costs, for example, as well in construction. Those things seem to be going up, up, and up. And sometimes I hear it's just access to people to even fix these buildings, let alone build them, is at issue. Do you have any concerns about the ability to get these items rebuilt, revitalized so that they're in livable condition now? Or what is the city looking to do to make sure that that timeline can be a little bit quicker?
Well, I think we've certainly seen construction costs elevate within the last couple of years. It does seem more recently maybe they've started to not continue to elevate in price. So that is certainly a positive. And in relation to these developments, actually some of them are currently under construction. So we're anticipating that they will certainly be on our timeline that we anticipate. With others, there are certainly quite a few very experienced contractors in and operating in the city of Detroit that have been able to get projects done throughout the last few years where we've really experienced these crunches. So we're confident that they will be able to deliver on these timelines, but it doesn't mean that we don't need to continue to attract additional contractors, subcontractors, train Detroiters to be able to do this work so that it can continue. And so it's certainly an ecosystem.
Maybe create a virtuous cycle of being able to build. That would be nice. You know, you mentioned timelines, though, Director Schneider. And before I let you go, I do want to know about the timelines for affordable rents for renters, because owners have said that with the investment from the city, they can maintain affordable rents for 15 to 25 years. But I'm wondering what mechanism allows for this and why they couldn't just say 25 years. Why is the window so open if there's an oversight component, or how do we make sure that the rents will be affordable for these renters?
So I think what we described is that there's a number of different projects and developments, and so each of them, well, we're putting $6.1 million. There are several other funding sources that are coming in, and so for each development, it is a specific number of years, but it ranges between the four, and what dictates that is the requirements of the various funding sources. You know, affordable housing typically has a lot of government funding, though each of those programs have their own rules and regulations, and so it is trying to identify those requirements. I will note that we invest our dollars in such a way that at the end of the term of investment, we make it so that we can reinvest and make sure to keep that affordability as it's a priority of ours.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is one of the things that I do think gets lost here sometimes, especially when you're dealing with federal dollars from multiple sources. Like you said, they can have their own requirements on them that can make planning a little bit more important or a little bit more difficult. But for what the city is trying to do in terms of funding right now, are there any more plans to renovate low-income apartment buildings in the coming years that you can tell us about?
Well, without getting into specifics, I can say that it's been our plan for several years to preserve existing affordability wherever it's at risk of potentially expiring with those contracts and requirements that we were talking about, and to extend it, but also to see that renovations are done. So we are regularly working. We have a team. We work with enterprise community partners, and we work with developers to put together plans for each of our existing affordable housing developments in order to, we call them preservation plans. Like, what is the plan to keep a property affordable? What kind of renovations does it need? And so that's all part of the regular work that we do in the Housing and Revitalization Department.
All right, Director Schneider, I'll let you get away with not giving specifics this time. But that means that when you do have specifics, you got to come back here on the Metro and share them with us.
I'd be happy to talk about preserving affordable housing any day.
I am also happy to talk about it any day. So, again, Director Julie Schneider, Director of Detroit's Housing and Revitalization Department, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Okay, thank you.
It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET, and coming up, we'll discuss a new state law that prohibits homeowners associations from banning rooftop solar panels on people's homes. It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET, continuing our conversation that delves into not only housing, but also ways to make it more efficient for all of us, and concerns about the environment and clean energy are something that we've really been focusing on this week on the show. But who gets to determine how clean energy is distributed in localities? Should it be a municipality? Should it be the individual homeowner? What about when you have homeowners associations? In Michigan, some HOAs have been preventing people from putting solar panels on their homes, and that happened to State Representative Ranjiv Pori's, whose neighborhood in Canton, Michigan, prevented him from doing just that. It caused him to spearhead the Homeowners Energy Policy Act, which prohibits a homeowners association from banning rooftop solar panels and putting other energy-saving equipment on a home. That bill became a law yesterday. To discuss it now, we have Democratic State Rep Ranjiv Puri with us. Rep Puri, welcome to the Metro.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
So a little birdie tells me that you got interested in this because of your own personal involvement when your homeowners association said to you, "Nuh-uh, no panels on your rooftop." Is that true?
I wish that was the story. It's close, though. There was other neighborhoods in Canton Township where I reside that I was hearing from where people were having issues. So it wasn't the genesis wasn't a personal gripe for me, but I am happy that now people across the state will not have to suffer from this issue.
Well, that's fair. I won't trust that birdie anymore, but while I have you here, let's dive into this issue, because if there were a bunch of people who wanted to put solar panels on their roof, but the HOA wouldn't allow it, what was the reasoning for the HOA's decision not to allow them before we get into the law?
It's purely, from my understanding, it's been purely aesthetic. I think, HOAs are largely run by a handful of individuals. And if for anyone that does live in an HOA, if you're making any changes or improvements, they need to be approved by the HOA. And sometimes all it takes is the subjectivity of one random individual, the HOA president or whoever, to come and see how something looks. And if they don't like the way it looks, then they're kind of the judge, jury, and executioner of the situation. And so it just really wasn't a robust process for determining, if homeowners should be able to make these changes. And so we wanted, as kind of the energy needs are evolving, as technologies are changing, as the HOA bylaws that were written in the 60s haven't been updated, we wanted to just make sure that we were modernizing, one, the HOA bylaws, but two, just providing a platform for people to take advantage of these new technologies.
Yeah, I want to unpack that a little bit more in a moment. But before we do that, I do want to make sure we talk about the specific law and what it does exactly. Sure.
Yeah. So the Homeowners Energy Policy Act, in a few short sentences, it just allows homeowners to take ownership of energy saving issues. And so it's not just solar panels. It could also be electric vehicle chargers and clotheslines and a couple other issues, a couple of the items that will allow people to make these energy-based decisions for themselves and will not be able to be prohibited from doing this based solely on an HOA's discretion. Now, what's very important to note, because there's a lot of misinformation, is that local ordinance still trumps the kind of the regulatory environment of this. So it's not like we're creating the Wild West where people could come on and put, just enormous solar panels that hang over their roof with pink wiring, or put a giant windmill in their front yard. Yeah. There's still setback requirements. It still must meet the aesthetics of the neighborhood. But again, it's just not subject now to just in HOAs prohibiting this for the sake that they don't like the way it looks.
Yeah, I think that's the tension point, with the understanding that I will get rid of the idea of putting a windmill in my front yard. You've talked me off of that. I still wonder about people who would say, well, wait a second. I voluntarily joined the HOA, and I did so for a reason. Maybe it was because I wanted a judge, jury, and executioner at Runjeev to decide what's aesthetically pleasing or not, right? You see the HOA agreement before you sign up. So what would you say to folks who might have some concern that this is an overstate? Now the state is getting more involved with the private individuals' decisions on what they want to do with the community they chose to join.
Sure. This is a great question, and you have to understand this from a macro level. I think the conversation just before was talking about housing. There is a shortage of housing in Michigan, and a lot of people are, when they find a home, whether they're buying into a specific HOA or not is not the top priority why they're buying the home. It's generally the way where it's located, the size of the home, or if it meets the needs. But it's generally not the bylaws of the HOA which attract someone to live in the home. And then on top of that, the HOA bylaws generally for someone who's buying a home are kind of like when you register a new iPhone and they ask you if you've read the terms and conditions and you just kind of press the accept button. There's very few people that I'm understanding that are reading kind of every sentence of an HOA bylaw agreement before they sign that. And so a lot of times people fall into these situations where they don't understand the restrictions that have been put into place. And again, the other issue is that a lot of these bylaws have been written decades ago, and HOAs either don't meet frequently enough or don't meet with the quorum of people to update the bylaws. And so we actually ended up hearing from HOA presidents themselves from around the state that said, hey, we've wanted to update this for a very long time, but we've been unable to do so because of our own bylaws.
Wait a second. All right. How is it possible that the HOA, that its own entity, is unable to update its bylaws? Do they need like 4/5 majority? How does that even happen?
Well, yeah. Well, yes. You need. I don't want to quote you on 4/5.
Well,
you need a majority of residents to come in and vote on a bylaw change. And what happens is when they call these meetings, not everyone in the neighborhood's geared up to want to come to an HOA meeting, and so over time, just people are unable to honestly change their own bylaws. And that happens way more often than you think. And then a lot of times when there's new builds happening, they're just recycling old bylaws that have been in place from a management company, again, for decades. And so we have new builds in Canton Township, and Canton Township, mind you, is one of the few municipalities that's actually growing in Michigan. And it's growing very rapidly. So we have all these new builds with people who are driving electric vehicles that want to either put in EV chargers or, like I said, solar panels, and have been unable to do so because the bylaws don't deal with this issue. And so this is just a natural evolution in terms of the new technologies that are available. And so given kind of, the reliability issues that people have, the cost of energy, this is just another solution. And so for me, it was a very common sense solution that just allows homeowners to make those decisions when, again, putting in the kind of checks and balances of making sure that local ordinances still do trump everything. So it's not like, again, I can go out and just buy whatever I want and put it up. This is limited to individual homeowners. Any sort of common area is excluded from this legislation. And so this is just allowing you to do to your home what you want to do to your individual home.
Rep. Puri, I would not be surprised by the difficulty of making these changes. So if these presidents, these organizations are concerned about it, let me just put it this way. Maybe HOAs have outlived their use. I mean, maybe the response should be we shouldn't have HOAs at all. Would that be something that's better? And make sure it's ruled by local municipalities and governments.
Well, whether you're putting a fence up or trying to get a pool in or whatever, a lot of people don't have the best interactions with their HOAs. And so I've passed some pretty monumental legislation this term in terms of common sense gun reform, and I was involved in the clean energy reforms. We've gotten more outreach about this Homeowners Energy Policy Act than any other legislation that I've had the opportunity to sponsor. There is a lot of excitement from around the state of people who are happy that they're able to do this now. And so I don't want to say that there's no place at all for HOAs. There certainly is. But I think, like anything, we should be just evolving the way we approach things as technology and things change. And so I certainly think it's important to look at the role of an HOA individually. But like I said, there's obviously there is a time and place for HOAs.
Yeah. Well, before I let you out of here, let's think about the portion of this that deals with clean energy. I mean, are we thinking about this too small with acts like this? Should we be thinking about the problem much larger scale, the need to electrify our grid really fast to get more transmission lines in? What would you say to someone who says we need to be, should we be dictating what localities are doing when they can't have an agreement? I mean, in terms of just upping our access to energy. I guess what I'm saying is this too small scale? Should we be focusing on the bigger, or what place do you think this is in our work to electrify the grid?
Yeah. I'm under no illusion that this is going to solve any piece of the energy crisis that currently exists. I think this is a great small step individually on a small scale, as you mentioned. But I do want to remind you that the state of Michigan did pass historic legislation at the end of 2023, the Clean Energy and Jobs Act, which enacted some of the strongest standards in around the country to have a clean energy plan for Michigan by 2040. Part of that was also like in that package was legislation that allowed homeowners and individual property owners to put large solar farms and wind farms on their own property, and enacted a process to kind of streamline, I guess, the involvement of both the state regulatory bodies and local municipalities. And so that's something that we've actually we tackled last year, and I think that will be monumental in terms of the step and progress forward for tackling our energy goals here in Michigan.
I appreciate you bringing it up. That's why we elect our representatives. State Representative Ranjiv Puri, Democrat from Canton. Thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thanks for having me. Have a good day.
It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET. One of the things the representative mentioned was there's a lot of misinformation out there, and it is something that we're all dealing with right now. So what's the cause behind it? Why does it feel like it's larger right now? And what can we do to fight it? We'll get into a discussion about misinformation and disinformation and the cause of people who create that. What's behind it when we continue. It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET. As you heard in our previous conversation, even when talking about the ability to put up solar panels on your roof, people are concerned about misinformation, especially when it comes to legislation we passed. And with it being election year, misinformation, disinformation are really top of mind for a lot of people. But what causes people to create disinformation, spread misinformation, and what can we do to combat it? To have a discussion about this and more, we're joined by Matthew Fasciani, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Notre Dame. He's got a forthcoming book coming out, Misguided, Where Misinformation Starts, How It Spreads, and What to Do About It, that will be published with Columbia University Press. Matthew, welcome to the Metro.
Hello, hi. Thank you so much for having me.
Happy to have you here. Let's start here with the idea of misinformation. I think some of us think, look, disinformation, it wouldn't happen if people didn't just make it in the first place. So do we know what causes folks to brand themselves or causes them to even create misinformation in the first place? What's the source of this?
Yeah, so misinformation's been around basically since the dawn of humans. It's a lot more common, at least we can see it a lot more commonly because of the access that we have to information generally. And the reason people spread it is for all kinds of reasons. I mean, there's financial reasons, political reasons. That goes into the term disinformation, meaning there's an intent to deceive when people want to purposely mislead and share false things to different groups of people. So there's definitely all of these factors that predict why bad information is coming into our environment.
You know, I think a thesis that you'll see from people, they talk about how with sheltering in place and with the COVID-19 pandemic, some folks felt like this put kind of lighter fuel on the spread and creation of disinformation and misinformation in that space. Is there any connection that we're seeing from that? For example, could loneliness, the desire to be in a social group that we saw maybe rising at that time, is that something that's a factor here from what you've seen?
Yeah, I think so. So I often think about misinformation and susceptibility to misinformation in the terms of identities and how we have these motivations to protect important identities that we hold. So a lot of identities are good or positive. For example, like being a parent, we want to support our children, and we feel good about doing that. But then we also have these identities, such as a political identity, that might bias us to process information in a way that makes us more vulnerable to believing misinformation. And I think what happens is when people feel lonely or unhappy, they're more vulnerable to drift into these more extreme groups online, or they don't have a lot of balanced social connections. So they're deriving too much of their meaning and self-esteem from this narrow lens of identities that I think would be helped if they had more social connections across lots of different domains, so they weren't purely relying so much on this their own self-esteem from this one or two identities that they might have picked up from an online community, for example.
You know, this makes me also think about interacting with other folks, you know, having public spaces that we used to go to. Now with being online, it feels as though if you're more interested in kind of just being in a group, or let's just put it this way, it feels like we might be segregating ourselves more by these identities, as you mentioned. Is that something that we would need to look at if we were trying to help combat disinformation or misinformation, or do you believe our time should be spent elsewhere in terms of trying to deal with this issue?
Yeah, I think it definitely would be helpful. There's research showing that having meaningful connections with people that hold a diversity of viewpoints tends to reduce polarization and susceptibility to misinformation. The trick, of course, is like what that actually looks like in practice. Like it's one thing to look at that in an experiment where you have people, come together and talk about things in a moderated way. But it's much more challenging out in the real world to actually see that in practice. But I think, again, a lot of it comes down to not even so much the diversity of viewpoints, but the diversity of social interactions and just having a more balanced social community that you're involved in.
We're speaking with Matthew Fasciani, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Notre Dame. He's got a book coming out, Misguided, Where Misinformation Starts, How It Spreads, and What to Do About It. Lack of trust in institutions, one of the places that we would rely on, one of the things you're relying on, studies, research that you've done, but there's some folks who would just dismiss you out of hand because, you're bought and paid for, or they don't trust the university institution that you're at. So when we think about the need to rely on, I don't have the time to do all of the research. I've got to rely and trust on somebody to do it. What do you think it would take for us to get more trust back into institutions? Is this something we should be investing our time in?
Yeah, I think so. Trust is huge, and it's so dependent on how people process information. So For example, if you have a lot of trust for a particular influencer on Instagram, then the connection you have with that person is going to matter more than, some scientific recommendation to some like abstract science community that you don't know anything about or anyone within it. So I think it is critical to really think about trust and how to rebuild trust. And it's very challenging. There's a few ways we can think about it as far as, one, thinking about just how we communicate as scientists or experts. I think it's really important for scientists to embrace uncertainty and admit what they don't know. That's one way to build trust and be really transparent about the process to how you're deriving your decisions and your findings. And then also I think it's important for institutions to make an effort to reach out to their local communities and build those relationships with local community leaders.
You also have had some posts that I was looking into when you were talking about, and you've just talked about it here, the need for creating that connection with your community. That's not something that institutions were necessarily known for because of that desire to not appear biased. So it feels like there might be this kind of competing interest, right? Like the need to talk in this technical terminology or try to speak in a way that feels like you're outside of bias, whereas, there's always these concerns about bias. So how do you interact with the ideas of bias versus the need for having trust in your institution? What do you think that institutions should do to protect against that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely it's tricky. And I'm not going to pretend that, there's a simple solution that if only institutions just reached out to a bunch of different groups, it's going to be an easy process. But I think there is some interesting research showing that, for example, building trust in scientists during the COVID-19 pandemic and the vaccines that came from that, if you actually meet with people, local organizations like churches and volunteer groups, not even anything political, just people that are in the community who a lot of other people are connected to. And if you make the effort to actually have those relationships, because again, so much of trust comes down to the social component. So it's not just, do you think someone's competent, but do you know this person? Do you like them? So if we can have this kind of bottom-up connection between institutions and our local communities and build those relationships at a local level throughout the country, I think that would do a lot of good.
Let's consider the situation where, you've been to the family outing or gathering. You have that one relative who has a really outlandish view, right? And you kind of want to castigate them because you say, look, that's hateful or hate speech or something. But then if you blow up the relationship, are they going to listen to you when you try to get them on the side of what you think is a good idea to maybe not be so prejudiced? So for folks who are concerned about, hey, if I maintain a relationship with someone with a bigoted view, for example, that incentivizes or rewards that behavior versus separating, what would you say to people who are dealing with that tension on keeping the relationship versus trying to fray it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really difficult question. I think ultimately it depends heavily on the individual and their relationship. So we found some research I did a while back. We looked at if people removed connections they had with their friends and family after the 2016 election. And we found that not only were people overall more likely to stop talking with people who didn't share their political views, this is especially more likely for those in the LGBTQ community. So it gets really tricky when political debates are about someone's fundamental rights. Then ultimately it's up to them if they want to maintain that relationship, if they think it's worth the effort to try to reach someone. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly all on your ability at that point, but it's something that we're going to be looking at, something we'll continue to monitor with you. Matthew Fasciani, postdoctoral researcher at the University of Notre Dame. Thank you so much for joining us on the Metro. Thank you so much for having me. And that's going to do it for the Metro for Tuesday, July 9th. You can listen to recent episodes online at WDET.org and make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. The show is produced by Sam Corey, David Lyons, and Jack Philbrandt, with additional support from Manel Scott and Sydney Walkley.
Our engineer is Nate Bender, and the music is by Sam Bobian and Will Sessions. The Metro is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University. If you like what you hear and want to support the Metro, consider becoming a member at WDET.org/donate. This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. We'll talk again tomorrow.
WDET is supported by the College of Business Administration at University of Detroit Mercy. UDM is offering a new master's degree in ethical leadership focused on sustainable, ethical, and inclusive problem solving. More information at business.udmercy.edu.